Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session titled The Current State of Technical AI Safety with Buck Shlegeris. I'm Max, the MC for this session. Following Buck's presentation, we'll move on to a live Q&A session where he will respond to your questions. You can submit questions through Swapcard using the live discussion feature in the bottom right. Then, after 45 minutes, we'll bring the session to an end. Afterwards, Buck will have office hours. But first, I'd like to introduce our speaker for this session. Buck is the Chief Technology Officer at Redwood Research. He currently leads the interpretability team and tries to figure out what research directions are likely to be useful for the reduction of existential risk from misaligned AGI. Previously, Buck worked at the Machine Intelligence Research Institute on research and outreach. He's currently a fund manager on the Effective Altruism Infrastructure Fund. Without further ado, please welcome Buck.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. So I want to talk about AI safety with current science. So what I mean by this? What I mean by this is a lot of us are worried about the fact that at some point it seems quite likely that some AI developers are going to build some really powerful AIs, and it's going to be kind of unclear whether it'll be safe to use these AIs, but people are almost surely going to do so anyway. A lot of people work on technical research so that when this comes up, we will be better able to handle it. And I think that a healthy question to ask about the technical research that goes on for AI safety every once in a while is, okay, but imagine that no progress happened. Imagine that everyone who works on AI safety research just fell asleep right now, and then they wake up and it's 5 years from now, and the AI developer, the AI company CEO, whoever that ends up being, says to the AI safety researchers, like, okay, guys, like bad news, like nothing has happened in the last 5 years in terms of AI safety technical research, but we have to go ahead now with the best technology that we have in order to use some powerful AIs. How do we go about doing this? I think this is an important question for a couple of different reasons. To start with, if you're a technical researcher, I think that understanding what the current best available plan is pretty important context for knowing how you should prioritize the effort that you put into trying to improve this technical plan. Like if you don't have a good idea of what the weaknesses in the current approach are, it's hard to know where to allocate your effort in improving it. And also for people who do not themselves work on technical safety research, but work on things where the current quality of technical safety research is an important input into their prioritization, I think it's also good for them to have a sense of how things are going. So that's why we're going to talk about this. I'm going to aim to talk about half an hour and then leave the rest of the time for Q&A. So a couple of meta notes here. I only have half an hour to say a bunch of stuff, so I'm going to simplify a bunch of things. A lot of the things that I'm saying here are controversial, and relatively few people who work on AI safety would literally agree, especially with the phrasings, though I think they would actually agree with many of the actual content claims. And of course, AI safety, in AI safety, almost no ideas are original to someone. Other people deserve credit for developing most of this. Okay, so here's what we're going to talk about. So to start with, I'm going to talk about this general concept of a safety usefulness trade-off and how that guides my thinking about this question here. Then I'm going to talk about a systems architecture that I'm imagining, which is the kind of thing we would use to safely deploy AIs if we had to, with no big technical breakthroughs. Then I'm going to talk about how to, in the context of that kind of systems architecture, estimate the safety and the usefulness with a particular set of choices that you make. And then finally, I'm going to discuss what I think the implications for people who are worried about AI existential risk are. So to start with, let's talk about safety usefulness trade-offs. So in my opinion, my core job as an AI safety researcher, and I'm incidentally going to refer to myself in first person as if I'm the person running safety at this AI lab, just for simplicity and for getting in the spirit of the exercise. My job is to understand and improve the safety usefulness trade-off. So I think that a lot of people in AI safety think of themselves as having a job which isn't making good choices about how to get as much use as possible out of your AIs for a particular level of danger posed by the AI. I think a lot of people have this kind of puritanical or activist-y instinct that doesn't mesh very well with cost-benefit analyses. I sometimes imagine the analogy of, imagine the US president talking to some general before they start a war. And the president is like, okay, I need you to tell me the options for how we're going to invade this country or whatever. And the general replies to them saying like, well, it seems to me that all of the options like probably will lead to some Americans getting killed. And I can imagine the president replying like, okay, obviously, all of these options will, in expectation, lead to some Americans getting killed. Your job isn't to tell me that invading countries poses risks to Americans. Your job is to present me with a list of options such that I can make sensible trade-offs between my different goals here, like my desire to succeed at this invasion and my desire to have, American soldiers not die. I think a lot of AI safety people do not have very much of that mindset and instead let the perfect be the enemy of the good by basically only imagining safety situations where they have achieved kind of unrealistic levels of safety guarantees. Like my best guess is that some of the most important work that will ever be done by people who are very concerned about AI takeover risk is going to be them working inside AI labs at the point where AI labs are building AIs that are imminently obsoleting human intellectual labor. And my guess is that at that point in history, the AI labs are going to be individually posing like 1% risk per year each of AI takeover from the actions done by that AI lab. And I think that a tremendous amount of good is going to be done by people who are working inside those AI labs while those AI labs are posing these objectively unacceptable, objectively massive risks. And these people who are working inside these AI labs are going to be thinking about different options for how to tune the deployment strategies they're using in order to keep those risks as low as possible. Another important frame here is Holden Karnofsky in his near costed deployment plan post has this interesting phrasing of balancing inaction risk and action risk. So in AI, obviously, like the risk that people normally think about is the risk where you deploy some AIs and then those AIs directly lead to an AI takeover. And this is what we might call an action risk. It's like you took some actions and those actions led to very bad outcomes for the world. But there's an easy solution to action risk, which is just never develop or deploy any AIs at all. And I think that AI safety researchers shouldn't just think of minimizing action risk as their whole job. I think they should be thinking of it as making it so that for a variety of situations we might be in where we find ourselves faced with both action risks and inaction risks, we're able to make good trade-offs. So here's a graph I have. So this is actually a graph from an upcoming paper we have at Redwood, where we consider a bunch of plans. So each of the points on this graph is, roughly speaking, a specific way of using some AI systems. And we graph two axes. One of them is usefulness, which is the amount of useful labor that we're getting out of our AIs according to this plan for using the AI. And the other one is the probability that if this AI is scheming against you, there's no doom. So, this is a measure of safety. So like on the right is plans that are safer. So a couple of points that I want to point at on this graph. This point here has very low safety and very high usefulness. And this point corresponds to the plan where you just naively use the untrusted model. You don't at all try to reduce safety risks from working with this model. Another point on this plan is refuse to use your smart model that might be scheming against you at all. And as we can see, this plan has an extremely low probability of doom. The probability of no doom is 100%, even if this model is scheming against you, because you just didn't use it. And the point of AI safety research, in my opinion, is making it so that we understand and can improve the space of techniques over here in the upper right corner, where we have a more reasonable trade-off between the usefulness and the safety. Okay, so the point in history at which I think we should particularly be optimizing our plans is the first AIs that pose really large risks and really large opportunities. A few years ago, I thought that the core job of AI safety researchers was making it so that when we built super intelligent AIs, we were able to align those. I now think that this was a mistake. It seems to me now likely that the first point in history at which AIs both pose really large risks and at which using those AIs is a really big opportunity is before the AIs are super intelligently powerful. The reason for this is, suppose that we had a bunch of AIs that were about as capable as humans. This would already be a huge risk and a huge opportunity. Suppose that you had a bunch of AIs, suppose that you could run in parallel instances of your AIs, maybe a billion in parallel that are running 10 times faster than humans and are about as knowledgeable as human experts about all topics. These AIs that are not going to be superhuman, basically, in terms of what they know and what they can do. They're not going to be able to think of things that are like wildly galaxy-brained. Sometimes when people are imagining super intelligent AIs, they're imagining these AIs that can just immediately have insights that humans would never have. And that's not the kind of AIs I mostly imagine thinking that we should work on. I'm mostly imagining AIs that just know a lot of stuff and are very fast and very parallel. And I think these AIs would pose a big risk and a big opportunity. I think that we're going to get access to that kind of AI before we have access to more powerful, super intelligent AIs. And I think that handling this kind of AIs would probably suffice for leading to good outcomes. Okay, so I want to talk about a lot of the high-level structure that I imagine using when we are building and deploying AIs. Just because I think having a concrete picture of what kind of way of combining the AIs together we might talk about is interesting for thinking about the risks that are posed and how we might analyze them. So I'm going to start out by showing you a relatively simple picture depicting how I think we might go about using our AIs. So the basic setup that I'm imagining here is something like the ChatGPT setup, where you have you have AIs, and humans basically talk to these AIs by messaging with them, and the AIs can also take some autonomous actions. So, for example, right now, ChatGPT is able to browse the internet, is able to run code, is able to do a couple of other things. But importantly, the way that it runs code and the way that it browses the internet is routed by software. It's routed through software that OpenAI controls. So OpenAI has set it up so that when ChatGPT wants to run some code or make some search, it basically just emits in its output a request to OpenAI that some code be run. And then OpenAI gets to control exactly how that happens. So here I have a diagram of how this goes. So a request comes into our model, and now we get this model, and then we're going to run that through a policy. I'm going to use the name GPT-6. I considered randomizing which AI lab I assumed was the AI lab that was building the powerful models, but I ended up just defaulting to OpenAI. Perhaps I should have chosen differently. So the first thing which happens here, so this is like a very simple protocol. So the policy picks an action. Some things the action could be are run this code, make this Google search, and then show me the results. Sorry, Bing search, and then show me the results. Or just like send this message directly to the user. And so then what happens is the action affects the world, like the code gets run or the search happens or the human gets this message. And then sometimes a while later, we oversee this. So what I mean by this is sometimes the action that was taken or the message that the model sent or the code that the model wrote is shown to some human who OpenAI is paying to look at some stuff that the model does and then generate some reward. Now, the way this would work in the future is, suppose that this human who was looking at the action that the model took decided that the action that the AI took was egregiously sketchy and dangerous. At that point, they would probably shut everything down. So suppose that it was just randomly the case that the action that the model had taken was a blatant attempt at hacking its way out of the OpenAI data center. In that case, if this was randomly sampled and some human happened to look at it, they would probably want to shut everything down. In the case where they didn't shut everything down, we would have just generated a reward, and then we would train this model on that reward. And hopefully the model would behave better in future. So there's basically two problems with this simple protocol. The first of these is that it might be the case that the overseer, even though the overseer sees the model taking an action which was bad, the overseer wasn't able to understand that it was bad, perhaps because it was subtle. And the other kind of problem you could have is the model is able to cause problems even if the overseer would have noticed that an action the model was taking was catastrophically bad. The model might be able to cause that irreversible catastrophe. For example, it might be able to, the classic example is the model is able to escape from the data center, like it hacks its way out of the data center. It might take that action before a human has a chance to look at that output, and both of these are unacceptable. So now I'm going to describe a somewhat more complicated setup which has some chance of reducing both of these threat models. So this is going to be a bigger picture, but luckily you guys are on laptops and so can look at these pictures in reasonably high resolution. Okay, so the first thing I want to draw attention to is before our request actually gets shown to our policy, we're totally able to filter and censor the input that GPT-6 sees. So for example, suppose you don't want your model, suppose you don't want GPT-6 to know what the date is. Or you don't want GPT-6 to ever see inputs that include good descriptions of how to build bioweapons, or even just attempts at descriptions of how to build bioweapons. One totally tractable option is to have it so that GPT-4 always reads every message on its way to GPT-6 and then flags it if it thinks that this message shouldn't be shown to GPT-6, or removes any details that it thinks GPT-6 shouldn't be shown. This kind of thing already happens in practice in some places. When you talk to Bing Chat, all of the faces of humans in images that you show to Bing Chat are censored, or redacted is another word you could use here, so that Bing Chat can't talk about them. So I'm basically just proposing doing that kind of filtering and censorship. And I think like a lot of the interventions that I'm describing here are going to have various effects that make it harder for your models to take really bad actions that have really bad effects. Another intervention we're going to do here is, as well as running the model on inputs that came from actual users, we probably want to run our model on a bunch of inputs that were produced by a synthetic inputs team. So what I mean by a synthetics input team is a bunch of, like, a team of your AI company, a team which works inside your AI company, which uses AI assistants to produce inputs which they think might particularly tempt your model to take bad actions. And so then when your policy is given an input, it's going to be unsure whether the input it was given was produced by a real user or was produced by this synthetics inputs team. So now the policy has taken some action and has like submitted that. Now, instead of just directly running it in the world so that it can affect the world, I propose that we first run what I'm going to call a monitor on this action. So the simplest example of this is what I would call a trusted monitor. So this is where we take this weaker model, GPT-4, that we're pretty sure is not scheming against us, and have GPT-4 read what this action was before we actually run it. So for instance, if our model was if our model is running a bunch of bash commands in some on some computer somewhere, or if it's writing code, we can have it so that before it actually gets to run any code or run any commands on that computer, GPT-4 reads the thing that it was proposing doing. And in the case where GPT-4 says, this was totally safe, this was totally fine, then we let it through and it affects the world. Otherwise, that action gets held for review and gets shown to what I'm going to call the catastrophe overseer, which is some process. For example, it could be humans which have AI assistants, which is in charge of looking at this action more carefully and determining whether this action is actually risky to run. And in the case where the catastrophe overseer looks at this action and then they say, whoa, this was actually egregiously unacceptable, then they will go back to the shut everything down option from before. And otherwise, we will have the same kind of, very occasionally, we take the result of this action and then show it to an overseer and use that to produce a reward that we train our model on. So this is a large picture that I think is a pretty realistic, minimal picture of how we will go about deploying powerful AIs in the future. There's a couple of things that I think are interesting to note about this picture. I guess like the first one is that when EAs are thinking about AI safety, a lot of the time they are kind of imagining doing something way simpler than this in a way that I think is actually quite unrealistic. And leads to them thinking that a bunch when people who got into AI extra concerns via the classic the classic sources, I think a lot of the time they propose particular failure modes, which I think are actually just clearly addressed by a bunch of the strategies that I've named here. So for example, sometimes people propose threat models where they say, what if your like scary unaligned model GPT-6 is writing a bunch of code on a computer, and then it just, figures out some way to copy its weights off the server. And in my experience, a lot of the time people are explicitly thinking about how easy it is to have GPT-4 just read all of the code that GPT-6 writes and runs before it's actually run. Now, obviously, this doesn't actually fix every problem that we might have. It's still totally possible that GPT-6 will be able to cause problems, for example, in a way that GPT-4 couldn't notice. But I think that you actually have to go through and make the full argument in order to have a real analysis of how dangerous the situation is. Okay, another point I want to make about this picture is sometimes when people are talking about AI safety, I think the argument for they want to see safety techniques which are simple and small. Like they want to have an argument for why it is that the deploying the AI will be safe that is based on very fundamental principles or something. And I think this is quite unrealistic. By analogy, consider the extent to which Google is secure. So Google has a lot of user data, and many governments want to steal a bunch of user data. And my impression is that, in fact, Google is reasonably good at keeping its user data private. And it's not the case that foreign governments constantly hack Google. They like occasionally hack Google in limited ways, but they definitely don't just have complete access to all of the Google user data. Now, why is it that Google is able to keep its user data secure? In my opinion, the answer is not because there's some extremely simple story that Google has for why their data is secure. The reason why Google's data is to a reasonable extent secure is basically because they try really hard and they have a whole lot of people who are constantly thinking about the question of whether their data is secure, constantly thinking about ways that their data might be insecure, constantly adding more layers of security or removing various weaknesses in their security. And I think this like all adds up to a complicated situation that ends up not getting hacked that badly that often. And this is roughly speaking what I think my story of optimism with AI looks like, or an important subset of it at least. Okay, so that's what I wanted to talk about with like, that's the kind of structure that I'm imagining when I'm imagining deploying a bunch of AIs in a way that might end up being safe. I want to note that the thing that I'm describing here, I don't think this is like a crazy impossible pipe dream to imagine. If you read papers, so OpenAI published a paper, Todor Markov was the lead author last year, or maybe this year, no, probably this year, about how GPT-4 is trained. No, sorry, how GPT-4 is, how they make GPT-4 not say bad things in production, basically. And they have this like complicated graph in there about how all the information flows around to make sure GPT-4 doesn't say inappropriate things too often. And the graph they draw doesn't quite have all of the moving pieces that I depicted here, but it has a lot of moving pieces. So I think that realistically, the approaches used to ensure AIs don't do bad things are actually going to be pretty complicated. And reasoning about whether they're going to work is going to involve reasoning about pretty complicated systems. Okay, so I want to talk about how to estimate safety. So here's my basic take on how to estimate safety. So it's because of the fact that we're going to try to ensure safety by building these really complicated systems, it seems really important that for a particular proposed setup, we have some way of estimating how safe that setup is. Sometimes people imagine ensuring safety by like having a really good, simple idea such that you don't have to really make measurements of the system during deployment to determine how safe things are. But because I'm proposing instead having very complicated systems, it's very important that we can actually make measurements for a particular proposal to determine how safe it is. So here's how I think you should do that. Well, it turns out that a very important question for analyzing how safe a system is, or how safe a proposed AI deployment protocol is like when you're doing this analysis, you really want to know whether the model that you are deploying is scheming against you. So I'm using scheming mostly as a synonym for deceptive alignment. Joe Carl-Smith recently released a report on AI scheming, and the classic resource is Hubinger 2018 on deceptive alignment. So basically what I mean by AI scheming is I think there is a solid chance that when people try to build powerful AIs, those AIs will be intentionally aiming to grab power. So they'll behave in ways that look good during training, with the goal of eventually gaining the trust of the AI lab such that when deployed, they can take actions that allow them to grab lots of power. So for example, the paper clipper is a classic example of this, like the hypothetical AI that whenever it's trying to make a decision, makes the decision in a way that maximizes the number of paper clips that are eventually produced. I think that the scheming hypothesis, or like the scheming threat model, is plausible, though not overwhelmingly likely. So there's basically two problems that are caused by the possibility that your model is a schemer. One is that it'll intentionally subvert your safety techniques. So what I mean by this is, suppose that you have some safety techniques that will almost always work. Like imagine that there's a building that has 100 doors and 999 of them are locked, but one of them isn't locked. Suppose someone tries the unlocked door and gets in. It's probably because they were purposefully trying to. Like roughly speaking, the way that you think about safeguards is very different if you are thinking about an adversarial threat model versus just thinking about the threat model where your AI will try to take random actions. And so, yeah, scheming leads to models intentionally trying to subvert your safety techniques. It also intentionally tries to subvert your safety evaluations, which is your attempts at measuring whether systems are safe or not. So here's how I think you should handle this. It seems to me like there's roughly two ways you could not get killed by a scheming AI. firstly, you could try to set it up so that your AI doesn't scheme. And secondly, you could try to make it so that your AI doesn't kill you even if it tries. Like even if it's scheming as hard as it can, it's unable to kill you. So I think that your AI not scheming is like 75% likely. Like that's my best guess as to what's actually going to happen. But 1 minus 0.75 is 0.25. The 25% chance that your AI is scheming seems like seriously worth worrying about. I think that the way that we should handle this situation is not very much based on trying to make it so that your AI doesn't scheme. It seems to me that it's much more tractable to reduce the risk of getting killed by a scheming AI by making it so it's hard for the AI to kill you, even if it's scheming, even if it tries to, rather than trying to reduce the risk that your AI is scheming in the first place. And the basic reason why I think it seems with current technology, basically like extremely hard to iterate on techniques that make it so your AI doesn't scheme against you. It's just like with machine learning, it's easy to make models behave differently in cases where you have examples of the model behaving badly. But the whole problem with AIs that scheme against you is they're totally able to follow strategies that make it very hard to distinguish them from a non-scheming model. And so at the current level of technology, it seems to me very difficult to do anything really that reduces the probability of your AI scheming. It seems much more doable to make it so the AI can't kill you if it tries to. So an analogy here I want to use is like I think like this opinion of mine in this previous slide is like quite controversial, or like very few AI safety people like explicitly think of their plans this way, but I really think they should. Especially when they're imagining what they should do if they actually don't get to make very much technical progress between here and the advent of extremely powerful AI. Maybe an analogy is, suppose you run a bank and there's this vault in your bank that has a bunch of gold bars in the vault. And you're trying to decide how to make it so that the people who work for you don't steal the gold bars. And we've got, you're like two different options we could have. One, we could try to improve our interview process so that people who are interviewing for the vault guard position, so that we're better at like determining whether those people are just trying to get the job so that they can steal the gold from the vault. And on the other thing we could try to do is make it harder for the people who are guarding the vault to steal the gold. And it just seems to me like fundamentally, if this is your position, it's really, really hard to solve this problem via the first mechanism, via the mechanism where you try to figure out whether people are planning on stealing the gold from you via an interview. And this is just because it's really easy to lie in interviews. It's just like, we just can't do very much. Like someone who is lying to you and trying to get saying things that will cause them to get a job. It's just like the advantage is all theirs when it comes to distinguishing them from someone who is telling the truth. And the part of the situation where you really have an advantage is setting up the system in which your employees operate to make it less likely that they can steal things. Okay, so it seems to me that when you want to make specific decisions about how to instantiate that systems architecture we were talking about earlier with a particular set of models, we should basically answer three questions. To start with, we should figure out what the probability is the models are scheming against us. And I claim that you should then basically just treat that as a fixed constraint when you are choosing protocols. Don't try to intervene to reduce the probability your model is scheming against you. Just think about these two questions. What is the safety and usefulness of this set of choices about how to deploy your model under the assumption that your model is scheming against you? And what's the safety and usefulness under the assumption that it isn't scheming against you? And then you just take the expected value of those two, of the safety estimate and the usefulness estimate, based on the probability of scheming that you arrived at earlier. So roughly speaking, how is it that we estimate the probability that the model is scheming against us? Wild guess, 25%. I don't think there's basically anything we can reliably do without like a bunch of effort that will update us 3x away from 25% by the point at which we're building AIs such that if they are scheming against us, it's a really big problem. And this is basically why I think we should de-emphasize trying to determine whether our models are scheming against us. It just seems really hard to get that much of an update. And it seems even harder to come up with techniques that actually cause a change here. So one strategy for getting a better estimate of the probability of scheming is the model organisms agenda, which you could read about, which Evan Evan Hubinger, Ethan Perez, Carson Dennis, and some other people are working on at Anthropic. I think this is a really exciting agenda, and I wish them the best. Yes, and like basically what they're trying to do is come up with settings in which things analogous to scheming models might naturally arise, so that they can analyze whether in fact scheming models arise in those settings. So I think that work is cool, but I don't think that it's one of the core mechanisms that we should be using to reduce risk if we have to move quickly. Okay, so how do we analyze the safety and usefulness of our model if it's scheming against us? Roughly speaking, my answer here is it's kind of similar to how you would analyze whether it's kind of similar to like how you would analyze security in the context of humans trying to steal things from you. Like there's this term, an internal threat, which is used in security modeling companies or like fraud prevention. And roughly speaking, an internal threat is just like if you're worried about people stealing stuff from you, one possibility is that people who are not employed by your organization steal stuff from you. And another possibility is that people who work at your organization and therefore have legitimate access to a bunch of things that your organization does, like a bunch of the resources of your organization, uses the affordances that you've given them to do their job and then exploits those in order to cause problems. And the way that you analyze this, my late uncle actually had a job like this, if I understand the story correctly. He worked at Shell, and Shell said to him, can you please come up with the best strategy that you can possibly think of to embezzle money from Shell? And eventually he thought about a bunch of things and eventually figured out that, there's this plan where it turns out that there's this public holiday that shuts down this Shell office and not this other Shell office. And if this one's shut down and the other one isn't, then you can do this thing where you tell this one to send you some money and the other one doesn't check, the other one's closed, so they can't check something and you can get this money out. And so roughly speaking, this is just the classic mechanism for ensuring security. You just say, well, given that we want to be robust to the possibility that this group of people are optimizing against us, let's just assume the worst, assume that they are optimizing against us, and then see how okay the situation is. And so this is roughly how I would recommend trying to reduce the probability of doom, given that your model is in fact scheming against you. Redwood has been doing some research recently on this assuming the model is scheming against you setup. Hopefully the paper will come out at some point pretty soon. But yeah, roughly speaking, I'm just I think that it's pretty plausible that this kind of strategy, where you do not try to reduce the probability your model is scheming against you, you just try to ensure that you catch it if it is, with just a 1-year delay to deploying your models, means you can have only 10% takeover risk per year, even if your models are deceptively aligned, even if you're using your models so much that your AI lab is able to go 30 times faster than it was going before it had access to these models. Cool. And then there's some other stuff you could do if you wanted to analyze the probability of doom condition on your model not scheming against you. Roughly speaking, I think it's a lot easier because of the fact that your model is intentionally subverting your it's not intentionally subverting your attempts to measure the probability of bad outcomes of various types. But I don't actually want to talk about that. Yeah, so I'm what are the takeaways from all this? For people who do not work on AI safety technology and just treat it as a black box, I think the basic summary of all of this stuff is, I think the situation is neither clearly fine nor totally doomed. I think sometimes some people associated with AI safety think that unless there are breakthroughs that happen in AI safety technology, we are just definitely doomed. I don't think that position is very defensible. I think the position that the situation seems like a mess, it seems very scary, it seems like the biggest existential risk, all of that seems totally right. If we were a very sensible society, I think we would take this a lot more seriously than we currently do, and be much more careful than we currently do. But nevertheless, it doesn't seem to me like the AIs are going to have a super easy time taking over if people are super careful about it. I guess this leads me to my second point, which is it seems like there's a lot of room to affect the outcomes of AI by changing how people behave during development of transformative AI. You might have thought that the situation is such that, the technical research is so far behind that it doesn't really matter how hard people try to apply accepted best practices or the best technology that we currently have to reducing AI takeover risk. And I think this is not true. I think the difference between a really careful and cautious AI lab and a AI lab that hasn't thought through these risks really carefully is like very large potentially in terms of the amount of risk that's posed. Cool. That's everything that I want to say. I guess like maybe the most important take here is I think, is if you're worried about the probability of scheming, I think you shouldn't try to reduce the probability of scheming. I think you should instead mostly plan on reducing the probability of bad outcomes conditioned on scheming. Great. Thanks so much. I want to take some questions.
Great. Thank you for your presentation. So the first question is, how much credence do you give to the recursive self-improvement scenario for fast AI capability gains?
So I'm like, definitely recursive self-improvement is in some sense a thing, right? Like it's already the case that, I mean, I use GPT-4 for my AI research all the time. And this, in fact, makes me more productive. My guess is that AI tools make me 5% more productive. When I'm programming, it's more like 10 or 20%. So I totally believe that AI tools will make AI research go faster. And that's kind of what I'm imagining, or like that's an important part of how I'm imagining this scenario playing out. But I imagine that the way that AI tools make AI more productive is much more like the AIs just contribute to making AIs more powerful in the same kind of way that humans AI is more powerful. I think sometimes people are imagining something more like the AI is like doing something which is qualitatively different from how humans try to make AIs more powerful. And I don't really understand what those people are imagining and don't think it seems like that important a part of how the AIs get to the first point in history at which they are, pose huge risks and huge opportunities.
Okay. Yeah. How would you address, or like, how would you think about addressing issues with less powerful AI monitoring more powerful AI? So your GPT-4 monitoring GPT-6, and then they say, so like, what if we can't trust GPT-4 to be sufficiently aligned or good at?
Yeah. So I'm like, cool. Yeah. So there's two different problems you might have with using GPT-4 to check to monitor GPT-6, which I think the person asking the question named both of. One is, what if GPT-4 is actually scheming against you? And two is, what if GPT-4 is too incompetent? So I have an alignment forum post recently on titled "Smart Untrusted Models and Dumb Trusted Models," which I recommend reading on this point. Basically, I think it's extremely unlikely that GPT-4 is like scheming against me in the sense that it is waiting for the perfect opportunity to reveal its true colors. Like GPT-4 really is like looking for the best possible opportunities to suddenly behave badly in a way that will lead to doom. That's like what the hypothesis has to be in order for it to be dangerous for GPT-4 to be scheming against me. And that seems really unlikely. Like for GPT-4 to, via misalignment, cause huge amounts of risk when running in that particular when running in the kind of systems architecture I was describing before, it can't just fail at random times, or else we will easily notice. So before we actually deploy our systems, we're probably going to test them out a bunch of times, right? We're going to have GPT-6 generate a bunch of sketchy actions and run those through GPT-4 and make sure that GPT-4 always points them out, or at least have a good measure of like when GPT-4 is able to notice bad actions and where maybe sometimes it's innocently not going to know. I roughly think it's going to be extremely hard for GPT-4 to somehow game this evaluation in a clever way, just because I don't think GPT-4 is clever enough to think through how to game evaluations in a clever way. So I don't think there is very much risk from GPT-4 actually scheming against us and intentionally making it so that GPT-6 can escape. The other problem, I think, is much more serious, which is GPT-4 is just too incompetent to tell whether GPT-6 is doing something bad. Yeah, I think that is absolutely a big problem. We can probably measure it up front by training GPT-6 to trick GPT-4 in various ways, like training GPT-6 to generate bad actions, which will cause catastrophes if they get run, such that GPT-4 monitoring misses them. In a paper that we are working on at Redwood, which will hopefully be released in the next week or two, we measure this kind of thing in a particular setting, and it's absolutely a problem. Yep, my recommendation is measure the extent to which that's a problem. It definitely does not just work.
Cool. What do you think the biggest bottlenecks for AI safety are at the moment?
Biggest bottlenecks to AI safety. I don't really know how to answer that question. Like in terms of like resources, or in terms of like technical problems inside it. What do you want?
They don't specify, so I guess whatever you have the most to say about
What
it.
do you want?
Um,
Oh, I don't know.
yeah.
You pick.
I was going to say in terms of like resource allocation or something.
Uh so I mean, we could be talking about resources in terms of AI safety technical research, or in terms of the world overall going well with respect to AI safety. I don't know. I don't really know how to operationalize this. There's a bunch of things I would like. I would like it if random ML researchers who work at AI companies and at AI academia thought that AIX risk was really important, or at least engaged with the arguments more, and then like came to more coherent opinions there. I think it would be great to have more researchers who care a lot about AIX risk and are very capable at doing machine learning, computer science, and software engineering. I think that a lot of good that has happened in the last year, in terms of interventions to reduce AI risk, has come through researchers working hard. And so I'm excited for more of that. Let me see if there's anything like pretty non-standard. Maybe a surprising thing which seems important to me is I think that computer security is an underrated bottleneck on AI safety. I think it's pretty likely that at some point in the future, we're going to want to deploy really scary models such that it would be extremely dangerous if those models had the weight stolen. And also such that, and when this is happening, it's very plausible that there's going to be spies inside the company who are trying to steal the weights. And it's very plausible that the AIs are themselves going to be trying to escape. And I think it would be really nice if there was extremely good computer security, making it so that all of these threat models failed to actually occur. And I wish that there were more computer security people who were like taking this problem seriously.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. How well do you think top AI labs are currently, or like would/could include theoretical alignment researchers, I guess, in the labs?
I don't know exactly what you mean by theoretical alignment researchers. I think that the work done by theoretical alignment researchers, I don't think is very useful for the things that labs are doing right now. So, for example, the Alignment Research Center, ARC, does a bunch of theoretical alignment research. That work is definitely not applicable to things that are being done with current models, and probably years of work will be required before it turns into something which is handy for, which would actually be useful if we tried to deploy powerful models in a safe way. In terms of like whether ARC could like live inside an AI lab, basically, I think it's generally bad for organizations to have teams inside them which have very different needs from the other teams inside them, unless there's like a strong reason for this. So I probably think it's good that ARC is not based inside an AI lab. Just because like the AI labs, for instance, like really want to be going fast and like really want to be like results oriented in a way that, and like empirically driven in a way that I think ARC shouldn't be.
Yeah. Yeah, a little bit of a different question, but are there any adult human intelligent enhancement routes that you think are promising?
This is not really my area. My guess is that yes, I don't have an opinion here. Sorry.
No worries.
Great question.
Yeah, okay. This question is a bit longer, but they're asking about DARPA, I think the US
DARPA.
DARPA. And they say that it currently spends about or it spent $2 billion in 2018 on AI research and continue to fund it before and after this. And I think they're wondering a bit about how sort of like this AI research, I guess, that we don't necessarily have like eyes on, maybe affects the state of AI safety, and also I guess like just governments kind of taking more interest in this or something, or maybe having more labs or something in the future.
So with respect to the first part of that, like the effect of DARPA on like DARPA research on AI safety, my guess is that it doesn't matter very much. I haven't heard about anything important which came directly out of that initiative, which I have heard about. Like I've heard about the initiative. I don't know about anything important which happened as a result of it. It's possible that I'm missing some stuff, but I don't think it ended up being like very closely related to the areas of AI that seem most important to me. In terms of the influence of, that's how I want to answer that.
Yeah, okay. This one is like again, okay, so they say it's kind of field related slash social, but someone's wondering if like your hairstyle has ever negatively affected how others treat you in AI safety. And I guess like maybe relatedly is like, do you think this should be a sort of concern people in AI safety like have a lot, or like, I don't know, your thoughts on this, or these sorts of things?
The main way people would treat me badly is like thinking miscellaneously more negatively of me. No one has ever come up to me and been like, you know what, Buck, I personally respect you less because of the fact that your hair is blue, which is perhaps unsurprising. Uh, I think that, I mean, I don't know. There's an interesting question about like how much you should allow your interest in EA to like destroy parts of your life that you like. I really like having blue hair. It's like an important part of how I don't know. I've had blue hair since basically the time at which I think I like feel like I became an adult, right? Roughly. And so it would feel like, you know, it would feel like pretty notably sad in the same way as if you told me that I like couldn't play in a band or like I couldn't drink coffee or something. I'd be like, man, I like that part of my life. It makes me sad to sacrifice that part of my life. Or like, you know, you can't express hot takes on Twitter, which is totally true. I absolutely do not express hot takes on Twitter, despite the fact that I might enjoy doing so. I don't know. So I'm like, I think that EAs should seriously consider doing things which make their lives feel dull and lifeless on the margin if they think that that will like increase their impact. And I have made many such choices over the years, and many people I respect have made other choices to make their lives feel more dull and lifeless. The particular sacrifice of having, you know, if I had to guess like the like impact maximizing choice, I just really don't think the blue hair matters very much. I live in Silicon Valley. I just don't think it's a very big deal. Yeah. So in conclusion, I think like in principle, people should consider making changes to their personal lives for the sake of appearing better to people. And if people want to email me evidence that I should more strongly consider making this particular change, I'd love to hear it. But I overall don't think it pencils, like passes cost benefit analysis.
Makes sense. Yeah, what could a software engineer do to get into the technical AI safety field?
Apply to I don't know. So like some options are in your current job, get better at what you're doing until you are an unstoppable god of software engineering. And at that point, people will like hope that people like fall over themselves trying to hire you, at which point you have an easy time. I think this is an underrated strategy. I think people who are like pretty good Google employees should consider doing this. I think probably like what I want to suggest is like stay in a holding pattern where you try to be like maximally badass while simultaneously like looking at opportunities as they arise, and then like take those opportunities if they look pretty good. So like you know, options include applying to full-time jobs, applying to ephemeral opportunities like Maths or Constellation is running this Astra Fellowship. Yep. So I basically recommend trying to become stronger and do well at your job while applying to things. I don't know what I think of people who just like quit their jobs and then like bum around trying to skill up in the hope of getting really good at relevant skills so they can get a job, or like doing independent research. I think the track record of that kind of thing is kind of middling.
Cool. Yeah, I think this will be our last question, but this person says that you mentioned potentially having like AI systems monitor sketchy outputs, and they're kind of worried slash interested in like the fact that this monitoring would be done by like AI companies who are maybe like incentivized to downplay risks, and like how do we avoid this like human social issue slash outcome?
Yeah, so I was just in my talk, I was focusing on what I do if I'm at an AI lab trying to advise AI labs on what policies they should follow. And I was not really thinking about the problem that AI labs might not choose to follow a particular policy. And I agree that like the question of like what should AI labs try to do is different from the question of how should outside forces try to make sure that AI labs don't do things that are unacceptably risky. There's a lot of complicated things there that I don't have a strong opinion on.
Cool. Makes sense.
Just before we finish, I wanted to clarify. I wanted to note that there were actually 2 errors in my bio, which I assume was my fault, not yours. I actually am not a grant maker on the EA Infrastructure Fund anymore, and I also don't research interpretability. So apologies for that.
No worries. Great. Well, thank you again for your talk. And if people still have questions, feel free to head over to Buck's office hours immediately after this.